Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back, and we are continuing to make our way through our 100 favorite movies of all time. And today we are up to number 46, an episode I've been quite looking forward to just because it features a movie I have not seen since I was a very little kid. And it's actually a movie that, for the first time, I feel like since I haven't seen it since I was a little kid, it was okay for me to watch it as a little kid. There's so many of these movies where John and I say we haven't seen this since we were like preteens, and it's like, what do you mean you haven't seen Seven since you were a preteen? But tonight we're talking about Amadeus and City of God. Amadeus, 1984, from Milos Forman, who I have Cuckoo's Nest incredibly high. Cuckoo's Nest definitely is more popular of the films, though both are classics. And City of God from Fernando Morales, who has done nothing else. The rest of his filmography is pretty trash, which is a shame because this movie showed such promise from 2002. I personally think one of the greatest international films ever made, arguably the best crime film ever made, and I can't wait to sit down and talk about these tonight. John, first time watching City of God for you, correct?
That is correct. It's been one of those ones that's been like lurking on my watch list for a long time. I just never got around to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of City of God. Really big fan of City of God. One of those movies that was really high on the IMDb list when I was back in high school, kind of rightfully so. So it was one of those. It's one of those that is very, very well revered by both critics and audiences alike. So yeah, very excited to talk about this one. We'll also say just off the top here, I watched 0 other movies this week, so that's going to be interesting when we get to that segment, John, because I have nothing to add. I lied. I watched Goldmember. Guess I'm talking about Goldmember. All right. Anyway, let's start with City of God. Let's start international, work our way towards Amadeus. I really didn't know which one to start with here. Next week's even more difficult, but for the opposite reason, because it's Children of Men and Memento, and then that's followed by Almost Famous and Shawshank Redemption, which all 4 of those movies are incredibly popular. These movies, not so much, more of cult following type movies, even though, as I just said, City of God always considered one of the greatest crime movies really ever made. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that Roger Ebert said one of the best films you'll ever see, and they put that all over the advertising for it. And this was really at the height of Roger Ebert, like, mattering. Early 2000s, internet coming in, more people have access to other types of reviews, but Roger Ebert still kind of owned the space. So this was a big deal. Ends up on my list. I think every iteration I've ever done of my top 100, City of God has ended up pretty high on. It's one of those movies, I remember seeing it when I was in high school. I really enjoyed it. Probably didn't understand it as well as I thought I did. Just thought it was cool to put it in my top 100. Watched it again, maybe like 2 or 3 years later. Loved it. And then didn't watch it for about 8 years and watched it last year when I was coming up with my top 100. So right before December of 2020. Watched it as I was coming up for it, and I was like, wow. That is some sort of filmmaking that is going on in this movie. It is pretty wild. There's a couple little things that I don't really like. There's a couple breakings of the fourth wall that I think are just a little awkward. But at the same time, I think some of that's just kind of lost in the translation of the acting. But the filmmaking in this movie is just second to none. Watched it again last night. There's parts of it where I just can't believe what I'm watching. To me, Benny's farewell is a top 5 scene in film history. You're going to hear me say that a lot, but that is one of the greatest things ever filmed. It is so unbelievable, and it uses kung fu fighting, of all things. It is so incredibly well done with the strobe lights, and you really think that it's going to be Little Dice. And not for nothing, Little Dice / Little Zay, whatever you want to call him, one of the great villains in the history of cinema, gets no credit for it because he's an international film, and that normally gets overlooked by American audiences or maybe European audiences who are going to really own this a little bit more. Being that this was a Brazilian film, kind of gets forgotten. One of the most terrifying villains of all time. It is haunting to imagine that little kid walking down laughing as he's killing all of those people who are tied up and can't defend themselves. Absolutely haunting, absolutely devastating. Creates one of the great villains ever. And I'm really excited to talk about this movie.
Yeah, this was a movie that, like I said, I've been meaning to watch it for a while. I know it's really highly regarded by those who really enjoy this film, and I can see why on a first watch. It is an incredible film. Some parts of it really make it feel of its time. There are a lot of like the quick cuts that were like really common in the late 90s and early aughts. And you can see that in some of the editing, but that doesn't make it bad by any means. It's cool to kind of go back to movies that use those type of techniques in them, because it's not something that we use anymore to kind of
Mhm.
elevate tension like they did back then.
Yeah, what's interesting is I really love what they do with this, especially at the beginning of the movie. You're like, "Ooh, there's something going on here. Like, this is really cool." A lot of really like heavy movements with the camera. Definitely has a. But
Mm,
what I love about the style of this is actually when it backs away from the quick cuts, because it almost starts to feel like it's a documentary at times,
mhm.
which is terrifying. There are times in this movie where you feel as though you really are watching a journalist's depiction of this. And that's why like a movie like Spotlight, which is obviously about journalism, which is different than this. But that's why like a movie like that doesn't resonate as much with me, but this one does, coming from the voice of a photographer who's working as a
Mhm.
reporter and doing all that and really telling you the story of this. There are scenes where Carrot and Blackie and Knockout Ned are having discussions and you're like, I'm sitting in the room with them. This isn't a
Yeah.
film. This is more than that because it's absolutely filthy. The set design in this is incredible, which is even scarier that I don't think there's really much set decoration going on in this movie. I think it's really just filmed on in a lot of locations like this. And but it's so dirty and it's like how could they replicate this? They couldn't possibly do it. And I think that realism is what sets this movie apart. Now I like the quick cuts at the beginning. I think that really works because the quick cuts at the beginning, it's kind of pulling you out of it because this is a moment that's
Mhm.
not going to happen till later on in the story. But when they just start telling the story of the trio and everything like that, and it takes its time and it walks you through, you feel like you're really watching these things take place and that it's not staged at all. And that is such an unbelievable feat. Also helps that you don't know who the hell any of the people in this movie are, despite the fact that Ellis Braha is in this.
Yeah, and the transition between characters in this film is some of the best transitional work I've ever seen from a narrative standpoint in any film. Because we get these moments where we start with the again, kind of like this late 90s, early aughts trope of I guess you're wondering how I got here
Yep.
scene at the beginning of the movie. And it's like, okay, this is gonna come back later, we'll get to it. And then we go into like the flashback to tell us everything. But then as we start with the trio and we start kind of transitioning around all of these people who are growing up in the city of God and as they're aging and maturing and going down their separate paths, the transition between each of these characters is so natural.
Mhm.
Just it takes this perspective where it's like focusing on one character, introduces another character, then shifts the perspective to that character. And it doesn't even feel jarring at all. It feels like, yeah, this is the natural progression for this film.
Yeah, the whole thing with Little Dice and his rise and the fact that you don't
Mhm.
really see what happened with the cops. Where'd Little Dice go? Where is he? Where did him and Benny end up after the Tender Trio go and have their situation? And now we see the Tender Trio kind of falling apart and what's going to happen. And to see it transition right into Little Dice's rise and him taking out everybody and the story of the apartment and things like that. And I think what's so cool about it is it really does feel like it's a story being told by a reporter the entire time.
Mhm.
Where, how do you think I got here? Well, that was this trope back in the day, but it's also kind of winking because it's like this is what a lot of reporters will do in their
Mhm.
stories, where it's like, I found
Yep.
myself in the city of God. How did I get here? And then boom, now let me tell you a story of how I got here. And I love that even though Rocket is our main character, Rocket is barely in this movie. Like
Mhm.
Rocket feels so secondary to every other character, and that's ultimately what a good reporter, a good journalist would be doing when telling the story of this city. It's about so much more than him. We see the Tender Trio and we see how he's affiliated with the Tender Trio, but that's it. We see the story of the apartment and how he comes to be in the apartment. He's only there because he's going to get a joint. He has nothing to do with either of these people. Yeah, we see him, trying to sleep with Angelica. We see him going to the what do you call it? The newspaper, whatever it is. He's trying
Yep.
to do all these different things, but he never feels like the main character of this story. He's allowing everybody else to tell the story of his upbringing and still raise the stakes for him as everything is going on. And we worry, is he going to die? What's going to happen to him? But he never once feels like the main character of this story. This isn't like a Ray Liotta saying, ever since I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. And now he's the main character of the story, but he's still
Mhm.
narrating it. This is, I am telling you the story of the city of God. I just happen to have been there during all of
Yeah, it's definitely a much more objective narration for this film.
it. Mhm.
And that's so much more important because let's be honest, Rocket's not the most interesting character in this
No.
story. Like, yes, it's interesting seeing him in contrast to the other characters in the story, because he does kind of go down this other path that is not readily available to the people who grew up in the city of God, right? You have these people who are struggling with financial and social issues and everything. They're living in poverty. So it makes sense that like a large proportion of them turn to crime.
Yep.
But to have a narrator kind of step back from that because they were the more gifted of them, right? The one who was more intelligent, could work harder at school and do that, and then found photography through it all. It's so interesting seeing that contrast in these characters, because we are introduced at the very beginning that Rocket and Lil Dice are about the same age. So it's really interesting watching like the dichotomy between those two characters.
Yeah, exactly. And how he's trying to avoid it at all costs. He's trying to play the straight edge. But I think another thing good about this movie is how Morales is able to capture the hopelessness of the situation without rubbing your nose in the fact that it's a hopeless situation. Like, he does a very good job of making sure you know that he really doesn't have a choice, but he's trying to find a way out of this any way he can. He's not going to go the route of his brother. He's scared of his dad. All of those little things. Yeah, he'll smoke weed and he'll do whatever, but he's not trying to go the life of crime. He's witnessing all the crime around him and trying to keep his feet on the ground. I think that's super important, and it's really well done, because we see so often. One of the shows that I think did the best job of this was The Night Of, with John Turturro and Riz Ahmed. I thought that did a great job. It was an HBO show, and it was about like being sent to prison, and the whole time you don't know if he's guilty or innocent, but when he gets to jail, he doesn't have a choice but to start doing criminal type stuff. And I think that this movie does a really good job of showing you like why a lot of these people fall into this. This kid is given the choice of, you shoot this kid or shoot that kid, one or the other. One of them's got to die. Now that kid doesn't have a choice, because if he doesn't shoot one of them, he's going to get shot himself. Those types of lose-lose situations that you can't even really imagine are so well presented in this movie. And we see it with Rocket a lot, and how he's trying everything he can to avoid it. But every time he turns a corner, he runs into a different form of trouble.
Yeah, and because Rocket's our narrator, and because we're kind of getting this more objectional look at everything, it allows us to better evaluate, and it doesn't set anyone up as an antagonist or protagonist in the story at the same time, which is really important. And it helps leading into that kind of like that reporter narrative that you were talking about earlier, where it is very objectional. And though we have these characters we're following along, we find it hard as an audience to cheer for little Zay, who's kind of been set up as this like big bad crime boss the entire time. But we also find it kind of hard to root for Knockout Ned, because he just also becomes this like massive hoodlum throughout the entire movie. And like there's so many shades of gray in all of these characters that there is no clear-cut protagonist to be rooting for.
Yeah, really the only one who's a good guy is Rocket, because when you look at Benny, even like Benny does the right things, but Benny is still a hood. Like Benny is still a hood. There's no doubt about it. That's just who he is. But he's trying to do the right things, and eventually we see him trying to get out of it. But he's not better than any of them. He's in the same situation as all of them. And I think, but those are the lines you have to blur, because the cops are getting paid off. We see at the end of the movie, all the cops are they have what's his name arrested, and they're going to get rid of, and they're going to let Lil Zay go because he's paying them and they don't care. There are no good guys in this, because in that type of poverty, in that time of extreme desperation, there is no good person. There is no bad person. There's just survival and take what you can get and do what you have to do. And, like, I will say, though, again, like Lil Z, Lil Dice, whatever you want to call him, easily one of the best villains of all time. And he's definitely the antagonist. But then at the same time, you're like, but he's on the side with Benny. He's not doing anything bad to Rocket. And really, the people he's killing are bad the entire time. And then when it becomes Knockout Ned versus Lil Dice, you want to root for Knockout Ned, because we see him be cool to everybody. It seems, we see all the bad things that happen to him. But like he says in this, the first time it was self-defense. The second time his life was saved. The third time he just did it because he did it. And now he has been completely corrupted, because once you're in it, there's nothing you can do. And that bloodlust and all of that, he doesn't care who he takes out. And it ultimately gets him killed at the end of it.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to kind of see like zero sum of this entire situation, where it's like it doesn't matter what side of this like turf war you wound up
Mhm.
on, both sides lose in the end.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the whole thing with like what this movie is trying to say. This movie's,
Mhm.
you think about The Godfather, you're still supposed to side with the Corleones for most of that
Yeah.
movie. You know what I mean? Like that's, normally considered one of the greatest movies of all time, but also the greatest crime movie of all time. And you're supposed to side with that family. In this movie, they don't want you to side with anybody. Tiago sucks, Carrot sucks, Lil Dice sucks, even Benny sucks, but you like Benny. You can't help but root for them because of what they're doing and how they're going about it. And you see Benny save so many lives, but also he's still the one who's dealing and doing all that stuff. So what good is he really? But it all leads to Benny's farewell, which is the real turning point, the point of no return in that movie, because that's when Knockout Ned gets humiliated by Lil Dice. Lil Dice goes and is trying to do whatever with Benny, and he's mad at Benny, and Benny's trying to leave, and then Blackie accidentally kills Benny rather than killing Lil Dice, and then Carrot has to kill Blackie because now there's no protection, and now it's just an all-out turf war. Because I also think what this movie does an interesting job of is shining a light on the fact that sometimes, and this is why organized crime became a thing in America early on, sometimes, even though organized crime is a bad thing, if it's keeping the peace because one side has all the control, sometimes that's actually a good thing for this community. And when Lil Zay goes through and he's killing everybody, taking down all the heads, now there's peace. Everybody's cool. You can walk around. You can do whatever you need to do. And then Knockout Ned comes in, who's supposed to be the one to kind of, save the city of God. And now everybody's getting killed just to get killed. So what's
Mhm.
really better here? I love that it brings you there, because so many movies try to do that and they never get anywhere near good enough at expressing what they're trying to express with all of that.
Yeah, the fall of the hero is something that's just so poorly executed in so many films and so wonderfully done in this one, because Knockout Ned, by the time we get to the point where he's like falling and he is becoming this more like villainous character, he's been built up only a couple of times as like this standout guy.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see the fallout of Benny's farewell and Benny's death result in an incident which just like is a catalyst for Ned then descending into the gangdom of the entire situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is one of the most important things that this movie is trying to say, is that like even when you're at a point where everything seems fine, eventually there's just going to be one moment.
Yep.
The instigating incident is just going to happen. That's going to turn it all to shit.
Yeah, everything, there's going to be a breaking point for you. That's going to happen. And in this movie, what is that breaking point? In this movie, that breaking point is everything that happens to Ned's family.
Mhm.
And he tries to make innocent people don't get killed. Innocent people don't get killed. Well, when you're in this type of situation, the only way you can get respect is to just kind of shoot around and kill whoever's in the way. And that's why the Tender Trio is ultimately unsuccessful, because they're trying to actually, if you think about it, the Tender Trio might be the heroes of this movie. The Tender
Yeah.
Trio was doing, all they were trying to do was steal from people to make it better in the city of God. Then they, of course, go too far, and now they're trying to rob from wherever, but they're trying to do it, and all of that really does come from Little Dice. It all
Yes.
comes from him, and so he's the one who starts the downfall of the city of God even further from where it was. Like they do a good job of the Tender Trio of making it seem like things weren't so bad back then. I always think about the line in
Mhm.
Cabaret where they're like, "I miss the Kaiser." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of how this feels in this movie, where they've gone from, okay, we used to have the Tender Trio, we thought that was bad. Now look at where we are.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of that whole, like the whole hotel sequence is absolutely
It's so
incredible.
good.
The fact that like Little Dice comes up with this idea, and he's like, this is the point where you start realizing, before we even get to what Little Dice does at the hotel, when Little Dice comes up with this idea, that's the point where you try to start realizing what Little Dice is going to become as we go throughout this movie. It's the first hints at that this character is someone who is completely motivated to be a gang lord.
That's all he wants to do. He
It's
doesn't
his
know how to do
entire
anything else.
purpose. Yeah, and when he comes up with this plan, which is to rip off this hotel that people go to have sex with people at,
Mhm.
and just take all their money. And it's a great plan from a criminal aspect, right? Like, it's a bunch of people who are going to not be prepared for such an incident to happen. They're going to have a lot of money on them due to the reasons they're in that hotel.
Mhm.
So it makes sense to do that. And then we get the cut back to Little Dice
Yeah.
going in and just shooting every single person in the hotel.
Yep.
All of a sudden, everything before that cutback makes sense as to why the police were so rampantly like trying to find the Tender Trio and
And
everything.
you can even see it with the Tender Trio. They're like, why are they camping out underneath us right
Yeah.
now? Like, we robbed money. It happens all the time here.
And then like it just starts clicking, and you see Little Dice and the like pure ecstasy he is getting from murdering these people, and it is absolutely bone-chilling terrifying.
Yeah. And that's when it's like, oh, this is a different kind of movie. Like, as
Yeah.
messed up as that scene is, every time it happens, I find myself smiling because I'm just like, wow, most movies wouldn't go there. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, I love Benny's Farewell, but the
Mhm.
two scenes that are that'll stick with you long after this is over are that one and the scene where Lil Dice is making them shoot the kids. Because
Mhm.
most movies would cut away.
Yeah.
And instead, they shoot both kids in the foot. They're both sitting there sobbing. And again, this is where it starts to feel documentary-ish because you're like, how are these kids this good? And then the
Mhm.
kid has to make the decision of which one does he shoot and kill. And we watch him shoot and kill one of the kids. That doesn't
Mhm.
happen in movies. That is not something that you ever see, especially in 2002 when you didn't have HBO really pushing these bounds like on TV and stuff. In movies, you weren't seeing things like this. This was kind of still a big no-no. And yet he went there and it's so visceral. I mean, you just
Mhm.
can't help but watch it because what did those two kids do? And I love what Morales does is with these two kids, it's neither of the kids that we've heard speak the whole time. It's
Yeah.
just two random kids that you feel really bad for them because you don't see they're probably just tagging along and they're the ones who got chosen to be shot. It's devastating. It's absolutely brutal. But that's what sets this movie apart. It's willing to push those boundaries, but it's not doing it in like an Eli Roth way where I'm just going to shock you. It's doing it in a way where it's like, no, this is purposeful. This is
Mhm.
done 100% on purpose, and it just knocks it out of the park.
Yeah, there's just this cerebral aspect to this film where it's definitely trying to make you think about the situation, about these situations that normally you wouldn't think of. I'm pretty far removed from Rio de Janeiro. I
Mhm.
don't know what these slums are like. I feel like I have been there through watching this movie.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a hard thing to do. Bring people into a place that they've never been, and make them feel like maybe we have been here before. That's such a hard thing to do. And this was a groundbreaking movie. It really was.
Mhm.
It's a groundbreaking movie. It's one that's not talked about enough in general. It's one that has massive fans. It has a big following, but it's just not talked about enough in general, casually, the way that a lot of other crime movies are. This one is something else. Like, it is guerrilla filmmaking. It's Morales just had a plan with it. He knew what he wanted to do. It feels voyeuristic at times. It manages to bounce between these characters. Shorty, we didn't even talk about the whole story with Shorty and how
Mhm.
he buried his wife alive, but then he's the one who ends up pointing out, hey, if you want to get the killers, they're right over there. Again, Tiago, I just mentioned him briefly, but another great character and watching his downfall. All of these different characters. It's so interesting to see how it plays out. And every time Rocket's about to become a hood, his human side comes out. And
Mhm.
it's so important to this movie as a whole. And it just works. And I wish that they would make more movies that are crime related like this. Like, so many times nowadays we see the mistake of, at least I think it's a mistake of, filmmakers trying to make movies look really crisp and clean and all of that.
Mhm.
This movie's filthy. You don't want to
Mhm.
go here. This movie's not trying to look sleek or anything like that. It is a filthy movie, but that's how it's supposed to be because this is a filthy place. This is not a good place to be. And it does a
Yeah,
great job of expressing that.
it does, and it's really interesting because, like, I maybe it's just because, like, I've had Shakespeare on my mind over the last couple of weeks, but it's hard not to draw comparisons to Romeo and Juliet in this movie,
Mhm.
with like seeing like the rise of these two warring factions and
Mhm.
everything like that, and seeing like a catalyst in it, like Benny's death. It's the same as Mercutio and Tybalt's death in Romeo and
Of course.
Juliet. And it goes to show how like that classic literature can impact films that seemingly have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and this is one that is definitely that way. Like, it really feels like it has nothing to do with anything, and it does. And I always think about that. Like, Benny's death really does feel like Mercutio, like what Shakespeare wanted Mercutio's death to be.
Yeah.
Like, it really does have that feeling. It feels like wow, this is straight out of that, and he figured out a way to actually do it better than it's ever been done because he had more at his, at his disposal. So I completely agree with you. I think it's a phenomenal just sequence. And I definitely see the parallels there for sure.
Do you think this film isn't as popular because it's Brazilian?
Yes, 100%. 100%. And here's the reason why. I think because it's Brazilian, if you think about generally the kind of films that come from international cinema and become popular in America, they're generally European. Very rarely do we see an African film. Asian films, it has to be the right director. Like, I'm talking Bong Joon-ho. Like, he's somebody who can definitely make that happen. And we saw that with Parasite. But even before Parasite, it wasn't like people were running around saying his name all the time. Japanese film is hit or miss. It seems more like anime, and that's really it. Obviously, you can go all the way back and you can, talk about Kurosawa. But other than him, who really made that jump? And I know there's other directors, but they're not mainstream.
No.
In South America, you see almost nothing. You see almost nothing. And that's like Wild Tales I have in my top 20. And that's an Argentinian movie. If that was a European movie, if that was made in Spain, that would be on everybody's top list. But because it's made in South America, which doesn't have a very big film market, it gets very heavily missed. This one was able to get past that and not be missed just because of how well it's made. But name another South American movie. It's not easy to do.
No, it's not.
In fact, I'm saying that to you because I don't think I can do it right now.
I mean, I did watch Wages of Fear last year, so that's up there.
Was that made in South America or just set in South America?
It was made in South America too.
Okay, so it was. Okay.
But it was a co-production with France, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
Which is the big thing, right? It also has an American remake of it. So,
what's the American remake called?
The Sorcerer.
I never knew that.
No.
Huh. Learn something new every day, huh? Didn't know that. Thanks, John. All right. Let's move on from City God. You got anything else you want to throw in there about it?
Watch this movie.
Yeah, just watch it. It's so good. It's so freaking good. And it's crazy that Morales' talent just never came out again in another movie he did. Because it really, really does not come out in anything else he's ever done. It's really disappointing. It's a shame. What was the best movie you watched this week? I'm going to answer first and say Goldmember because it was the only movie I watched this week. Love the Austin Power franchise. Finally got the third one in. That one's the one that really worked its way into my vocabulary and everything, my daily speak, more than all the others just because of the timing when it came out. Super entertaining. Fat Bastard, Mini-Me. Love Mini-Me being Austin Powers for half the movie. It's great. Mike Myers, it's a shame he kind of fell off the face of the earth because he was freaking hilarious when he was on. But that's all I got because that was the only one I watched this week. John, what'd you have?
I watched a lot of mediocre films this week. As I'm trying to go through all of these Oscar nominated films before we get to our Oscar predictions podcast. We need to have one up on you this year.
Yeah, you're going to.
So I'm going through all of them. So I watched almost all of the documentaries this week, and those are really hard. Documentaries are really hard to rate. And they just they all feel like a 2.5 movie to me because they're interesting, but does subject matter make the movie great in that case?
And not for nothing too, John. I just sorry to interrupt here, but not for nothing too. Every documentary should be captivating.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
That's the thing.
What makes one well made compared to another one? They all should be captivating.
Which is the nice thing with this year's documentary bash. I mean, we'll talk about it later, but. There are a lot of different types of documentaries this time around, which is really nice. But other than that, I watched some other things like The House of Gucci, which was, man, Ridley Scott has fallen off the earth having watched Alien last week. But hands down, the best movie I watched this week. I went to an advanced screening of The Batman yesterday. And we're on Dark Knight level of Batman movie here. This movie was absolutely incredible. Matt Reeves finally delivers on a neo-noir Batman feel for a movie.
Mhm.
3 hours long, didn't feel anywhere near that long.
This is one I'm probably going to watch because I don't have the same affliction towards Batman as I do for all of John's gone. I don't have the same affliction towards Batman as I do for all of the Marvel universe. So hopefully John comes back here. It looks like all his devices disconnected. I'm looking forward to watching the Batman though. John's back. John, I'm looking forward to watching the Batman. That's all I was saying.
Yes, yeah, I could hear everything you were saying.
You could hear everything. You were just gone.
I was just gone. No, it was absolutely. I had really high hopes going into it with like Matt Reeves being the director. Obviously, we've talked about Cloverfield previously on the podcast and how much we enjoyed that movie. The latter two films of the new Planet of the Apes trilogy were both done by him, so I had really high hopes. And the performances in this movie were absolutely incredible. It was great, and I can't wait to hear what everyone else has to say about it.
So far, the reviews have been good. That's all I know. So that's a good thing. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I love Matt Reeves. I think Matt Reeves did a great job with what was it? Let the Right One In, the remake. Let Me In. It was a great movie. He's got quite an eye. So definitely going to check that one out. Once I get through all of the Best Picture nominees, I have to watch all the Best Picture nominees. I got to watch horror movies, and then I still have like 3 movies from the library that I got to get through. Otherwise, they're going to yell at me. So, yeah, we'll get there. Amadeus was one of those movies, though, that I had from the library. So, John, why don't you talk about why Amadeus is here at number 46?
Amadeus is always touted as one of these like worst Best Picture winners, and like I get the argument because 1984, not a great year for film. I get that. I'm pretty sure on both of our lists, this is the only movie from this year.
Yeah, but I do love The Killing Fields. I will say that.
Yeah, but this movie. This movie hit me differently. Like I studied music in university, so obviously a movie about Mozart was going to really resound with me, especially as a horn player. Mozart kind of has a big deal for us horn players. But what this movie does, this is one of the greatest rivalry films ever made, hands down. What F. Murray Abraham brings to this movie as Salieri is just unparalleled. There's no question in my mind as to whether or not he deserved the Best Actor win this year. He's absolutely incredible.
He's against Tom Hulce too.
Yeah, and Tom Hulce also absolutely incredible in this film. This movie is just so well made. It's absolutely gorgeous. The use of Mozart and Salieri's music throughout is so powerful. And it's just so fun.
So I have to disagree with one thing. I don't think this is generally considered one of the worst Best Picture winners. I think the problem is it's never considered one of the worst or one of the best. So it just gets completely pushed to the side. When AFI did their original top 100 list, which also housed A Birth of a Nation, which it can no longer house because of the content, even if the filmmaking is great. Amadeus was number 53. So it was on there. Like it was like, and like you think about like if it's on AFI, very rarely are you going to say, well, a movie that's on AFI's top 100 is considered one of the worst Best Picture winners because anything that gets on there, that means it's getting credit somewhere. But the biggest thing is I feel like it's just very unseen by a lot of people because of when it came out. The 80s are the worst decade for film. Like they really just are. And, you know, I make a lot of grand statements like that on this podcast. I barely have any 80s movies in here. The ones that I do have aren't as good as a lot of other decades. And there's just not as much depth in the 80s, which is disappointing. F. Murray Abraham is all-time great. All-time great in this movie. His facial expressions in this movie are second to none. He is just on a different level. Like I forgot. So I hadn't seen this movie probably since I was like 13, 14 years old. I forgot how incredible this performance is. I remember Tom Hulce's laugh and all of that. You know, he's entertaining. He's all over the place. F. Murray Abraham takes this to a whole nother level to the point where I would argue that without him, with any other actor in this movie, this is a 3-star movie. It looks amazing and it's a good story. But F. Murray Abraham elevates this so much. It's incredible. So I love him. That's the first thing. Tom Hulce is great as Mozart. Yes, he doesn't do a German or an Austrian accent, whatever you want it to be. He doesn't do anything. He speaks very English, but whatever. Schindler's List, they try to force him sometimes and then have to carry, you know, it is what it is. Doesn't matter. Like we understand that it's in Germany and that this isn't a German person playing the role. It's the point. It was made in America, or Austria, whatever.
Yeah.
However, he's great.
Mhm.
The side characters are so much fun to watch as they try to navigate this, and how we're seeing this from the point of view mostly of F. Murray Abraham. But the set direction and the production design of this movie are what really just blow this thing out of the water. If like, and again, that's why this movie could be about paint, like nothing happening. It could be about
Mhm.
people we'd never heard of, whatever, and it would still work because
Yeah.
of how massive everything they do is. The theaters and the different rooms they're in, and just the way that they capture Austria at this time period. It's all so incredibly well done. And I love that it's pretty much a completely fictitious take on what this rivalry was really like. And yet it works so well that you're just like, man, this is a movie. Now I got to go look up
Mhm.
what actually happened between Mozart and Salieri. And then you're going to be very disappointed because pretty much nothing happened. But it is so entertaining and interesting the entire time. One of the best biopics really
Mhm.
ever made. It really, really is. And it's crazy that it doesn't come up more than it does right like now, because it should come up more.
Yeah, it's kind of faded into the halls of just forgotten movies, which is a shame because right from the get go, you start this movie with Salieri attempting to commit suicide,
Mhm.
and right then you're already hooked. You're like,
Yeah.
oh my god, what is happening? And then we get the priest coming in to talk to him about it,
Mhm.
and he plays two of his pieces, and then he finally plays the Mozart piece, and the priest knows it and recognizes it, and at
Yeah.
that point, like you can just tell how much Salieri hates
Yeah.
Mozart.
Yep. Yep. And it starts off as a respect, and then it's no, this guy was an ass. He just ran around, he was spoiled, he was everything, and he didn't take it seriously, but he could do everything. And one of my favorites is when he just looks at him, he goes, not quite right at the end there, is it? And he just fixes it and he does something
Mhm.
better. And Salieri just has to stand there and take it, and he takes it over and over and over again. And I thought that opening is great. And that's something that I remember where it's, have you ever heard this one? This one brought down the house the first time. You ever heard this one? You ever heard this one? Have you heard this one? Oh, of course I've heard that one. It is amazing how there's just certain pieces by certain musicians that you're going to remember. And even if you're not going all the way back there, just think about or songs from the 60s, 70s, whatever it is.
Mhm.
There's probably so many songs that people will listen to that they think is one band, and then they find out is actually a different band, and they just assume their whole life because that was the popular band at the time.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what's happening to Salieri here is nobody remembers him. Nobody knows about him. Nobody cares about him because he was never able to get to the people the way that Mozart was.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we have to look at the way that Mozart is revered in today's society
Mhm.
for what he did for music. He essentially is like the pinnacle of the classical era. Like he starts off the classical era before like Beethoven ends it afterwards, and he's just so important. So when we finally get to see this, we're gonna think this film's constructed in a way, like you said, the relationship between Salieri and Mozart in real life was nowhere near as
No.
vengeful as this. It was amicable at worst, from what I
Mhm.
understand. Uh, they probably like knew of each other, but didn't really communicate with each other ever.
Mhm.
And but what they've done with this film is they've just taken this character that is so prolific nowadays that it's so easy for us to believe everything Salieri is saying.
Yes. And and what do you really know about Mozart? You know what I mean? Like if you really think
Mhm.
about it and break it down, what do you know about Mozart as a person? Now you're going to know more because you studied it and all that. But in terms of like we don't really know. Like it's the same thing. Like all you can do is based on the legend. People weren't
Mhm.
recording people back then. It's not like there were cameras in your face all the time or anything like that. So all you get is what you heard about. And so this is subverting expectations because most people only know Mozart for his music. Most people don't
Mhm.
know what his personality is supposed to be like. So you just buy into this. And I think that's fun to play with that kind of like, what is the legend? What was behind the scenes of this legend? I just think that that's a cool idea. And was it Peter Schaefer wrote the stage play and then it was turned into this movie? Like just brilliant. to do this,
Mhm.
because at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be about Mozart and Salieri. It can be about we pretty much see this exact same movie, and it's called made by Christopher Nolan, called The Prestige, just done
Mhm.
way worse.
Yep.
I think The Prestige is garbage. So that's just my opinion. I think that movie is just full of plot hole after plot hole after plot hole. But like, it's very much the same thing. It's about these two huge characters, two huge people who are at the top of their game, and one jealous of the other and trying to take that person down because they can't figure out what to do with it. And we see it over and over in this movie. Salieri, oh, I'll talk to them. And then he goes and tries to get Mozart pushed further and further back. It's just so smart
Mhm.
throughout. And it's subject matter that didn't have to be interesting. And we've seen movies like this, biopics in general, that are done that just aren't interesting. But this one is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes from the way that this rivalry is really approached, where it's one sided because
Mhm.
Mozart doesn't care about Salieri because Mozart
At
doesn't
all.
have to because he's Mozart.
Yep.
But Salieri doesn't. It isn't even like Salieri hates Mozart because he's getting all the attention and everything. Salieri hates Mozart because he's this perpetuant child,
Mhm.
but he has such a respect for his music because his music is genius.
Yep.
And like throughout the entire film, no matter how much Salieri wants to end Mozart, he always respects the music Mozart makes.
Well, and that's the tough part. It's like, how do you come to terms with the fact that, like, man, this guy sucks, but he's so talented. What else can you do except be still in awe of him? You're just disappointed. You never meet your idols.
Mhm.
You know, that's the biggest thing. And he meets this guy, and he's actually excited about it. What was this man going to be like? What was this legend going to be like? And he turns out to just be a total ass. There's really no
Yeah.
better way to put it. He's just a
No,
total ass.
no. But who does Salieri blame for it? Because it's not Mozart he blames for it. One of the
Yeah.
beautiful characterizations of Salieri's character is his renouncement of God throughout this
Yeah.
entire film.
This is a
And just,
very religious movie.
it's incredibly religious.
Mhm.
And what is it? The line, I wrote it down. I will block you, I will hinder you, and harm your creation on earth.
Mhm.
That's not Salieri digging at Mozart. That is Salieri spitting in the face of God.
Yeah. And he does that a lot in this movie. Like
Yes.
a lot in this movie. Like this, that is something that we see over and over and over again throughout this movie, is him just being like, I am over this. I am done with this guy. And that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's him praying and saying, hey, I want this to be better. I want this to be whatever. And always, every time he prays for it, something else happens that just makes him feel like, man, God just does not care
Yeah.
at
I
all.
mean, again, another line. That was not Mozart that night. It was God laughing
Mhm,
at me.
mhm.
Like these this conviction in Salieri and this like hatred growing and festering inside him, contrasting to his remorse that he's having based on the opening of the film and like the older Salieri scenes, it's brilliant because it just brings you into it so much to understand what this character is going through, to understand that he has just realized Salieri held the most important
Mhm.
role for a musician in Vienna,
Yep.
in Austria, arguably in the entire musical world as the court composer in Vienna. And to just be completely overshadowed by Mozart had to have been the most demoralizing and frustrating thing possible.
Yeah. Exactly. And he can't just it's that whole thing where, like, artists are never satisfied. He can't just be satisfied with the fact that he has this position, he has this high ranking spot, he is respected, he's all of those things. No, no, no. He also needs to be the best. And if he's not going to be the best, he can't not be the best to this guy.
Mhm.
It's fascinating. It really is. It's pretty amazing.
And then when we look at the character of Mozart, like I said, he's this perpetual child. Like the first time we're introduced to Mozart, he's literally chasing a woman around a room
Yep.
and like acting like a child. And Salieri is just flabbergasted when he finds out that that is who Mozart is. And then Mozart comes in. He not only corrects Salieri's entrance march, but then he also breaks all of these rules that the emperor has put in place for compositions. And he's just like, yeah, go for it. The scene where they're doing Marriage of Figaro and they take the music out from the ballet,
Yeah.
and you just see these
So
people
good.
dancing around on stage, and it's like, this is ridiculous. And the emperor realizes it's ridiculous, and this is just Mozart being like, okay, cool, I'm breaking your rule about having a ballet in the opera.
Yep. Now, what do you want to do about it?
Yeah.
And all the behind the scenes of making sure that Mozart still ultimately isn't going to be financially successful with any of this stuff, despite the fact that everything is brilliant, because everybody is so against him that they're trying to make sure he's never successful with any of it.
Yes, and it's Salieri's desire to make Mozart fail even like extends past that. I mean, obviously, I had to watch the director's cut because it's like the only version.
It's
of
the only one that exists now.
So there's the scene where Costanza comes back after presenting the works and like strips down, and then Salieri's just like calls in the guy and like completely embarrasses her. That's the extent that Salieri is going for in here. Salieri wants to cripple Mozart as much as possible from behind the scenes.
Yeah. Exactly. See, Salieri to me reminds me of, and I always go to this one because it's just the easiest. And I think it's one of the great characters of all time. Reminds me of Littlefinger. It's that this was really happening back in those days where like the word of mouth was everything. And if you got to a position of respect, your word meant a lot. And we see it with Salieri in this movie because he's so well respected. He can say whatever he wants, and it's going to help take other people down. But at the end of the day, no matter what Antonio Salieri says, we are never going to then respect or know his music better than Mozart's, because at the end of the day, Mozart's the one who became famous. There's no way to stop that. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. It's the same way now. And I mean, it's a much darker look at it, and not from a rivalry standpoint. But now Kevin Spacey's whole thing comes out. That doesn't mean you don't know the name of Kevin Spacey. And guess what? People are going to know Kevin Spacey's name for decades and decades and decades and decades.
Yeah.
It's obviously a different situation, but no matter what you try to do, it's very hard to just wipe people off who at one time had any type of talent or were in any type of public eye. And we see that in this movie. Salieri tries over and over and over again. It doesn't matter how poor you make him. It doesn't matter. If people know he exists and if people hear it, he's going to have held some status, and that's all it's going to take.
And then in the end, the only way Salieri can get to a point where he's claiming victory over Mozart is in pretending to be the ghost of Leopold, his dead father, and commissioning the Requiem.
Yep.
Which is arguably one of the best pieces Mozart's ever written.
Yep. Yep. And I mean, yeah, that ending I love that ending so much when it's like, oh, they said the money and all that. And then he comes back and they just start writing it together. I just think that part is just like,
it's so powerful because
it's so powerful. You
see it in Salieri, because again, it goes back to that respect aspect of the character of Salieri, where he's sitting there, he's writing this. Mozart's literally like on his deathbed at this point, and Salieri is writing it down. And he just like, he sees it and he appreciates it, and he, like any composer will, he hears it as he's writing it down and realizes the genius that Mozart's putting into this piece.
Yeah. And he wants it to be good. At that point now, he's all in. He's ready to go. He wants it to be good because, hey, this is his chance, just like it's Salieri's.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
Or I mean, just like it's Mozart's, I'm sorry, but he wants it to be good.
Yeah, because in the end, Salieri's a musician and he appreciates the music of it. And that's the most important thing that F. Murray Abraham brings to this, is that whenever he looks at the music, whenever he sees the music, when Costanza brings him the scores to look over, and they're all originals, and he's just in awe at the fact that there's no corrections on them whatsoever. They're all just there.
They were originals, and they were the only, and there was nothing. It was already in his head.
Yeah, it's just like, it's that deep admiration yet jealousy that Salieri has that really drives this film.
Well, and it's interesting too, because the jealousy never starts to feel cartoonish. The jealousy always veers its way back to being about respect. Because a lot of movies that are about jealousy and things like that, they really will just veer right into the jealousy aspect of things. This one really does a good job of saying like, oh yeah, no, it was brilliant. That first night, his performance, it was the best thing I'd ever heard. So I made sure that it only played for 5 nights or whatever it was. Like
Yeah.
there's a really interesting dynamic there because so many movies would just make it easy and be like, I was angry. I hated him. And I made sure not like, no, he still wants to hear the music. He still wants it out there. He still can't get over how incredible everything this guy's doing is. He just wants him to not be successful.
And the movie also shows that like he's not the only one in the court who doesn't want Mozart to be successful either. Because it shows that like on these other court officials that it's really grinding on them. The scene where the emperor yawns.
Oh, it's so good. And they're all so happy.
They're so happy. They're ecstatic. Yeah. They're just like, yes, we're getting this over. Like he yawned once. It'll last 10 shows. That's it.
Yep. And that means he's done. He's done. Yep. And now this one won't work, even though you know it's brilliant. Can you go help me, Salieri? Go talk to him about it. He says, sure, Mozart, sure. And then he just goes and he goes and talks crap about him and says, I love the part where he's trying to get the pupil and he goes, I don't think that he should be around women alone.
Yeah.
So good. It's so good. It's just like, and it's crazy to me because Milos Forman gets so much credit for Cuckoo's Nest, which I do think Cuckoo's Nest is the better movie. I love that movie.
Yeah.
But he really doesn't get that much credit for this one. He won the Oscar for it. So, that helps. But Milos Forman, much like the person he was up against, which was Roland Joffe this year for The Killing Fields, they made 2 great movies, and that was really it. And I think that's what hurts them ultimately. Like, Roland Joffe made The Killing Fields, and he made The Mission, which is a great movie. Milos Forman made One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and this. Then he went and made I'm sorry, now I'm thinking about Morales. He went and made The People versus Larry Flint. A good movie, not like anything that you're like that you need to write home about. Like it's not amazing. And he made Man on the Moon, which is very weird. That's really it. There's really nothing else in his repertoire where you're like, wow, I got to sit down and I got to watch those movies. And I think that also hurts the legacy of this movie because his direction in this movie is incredible. It's great. It's top notch from beginning to end. I love all the scenes of, Salieri hiding and we're getting like these voyeuristic shots from under the table and from over here and whatever it is. And like the intro of Mozart of like, who is this man, and deciding to not show him in full for so long and build up all of this tension. It all really, 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 really works. And yet I think because he never made another great movie after this, I think that's also what keeps this movie from reaching that level. And F. Murray Abraham and Tom Hulce just aren't big names the way a Jack Nicholson is from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I think all of those things add up to this one just kind of being overlooked, despite all of the great things that are in it. And a lot of the techniques that you see just taken in other movies. I mean, if you really break this movie down and put it side by side with The Prestige, they're like the exact same thing, except one you've heard of the people, the other you haven't, and one's about magic and trying to take down somebody that way. But you have the more sophisticated versus the less sophisticated, but the less sophisticated is more talented, and it's the same movie.
Yeah, and like you said, like with a movie like that, when there's this version of it, when there's Amadeus, it's hard to replicate this formula again.
It is.
There's just so many things that need to go into it. You have to kind of rely on the fact that the characters you're focusing on are well known enough to draw in an audience, but not well known enough for people to know everything about them. You need these incredible performances. You need the performances. Like the fact that F. Murray Abraham's performance is so strong in this, yet Tom Hulce is still able to like stand up to him in some of these scenes. Is incredible, and it goes to show why both of them were nominated for Best Actor this year.
Yeah, one of the only movies to ever have 2 people in both nominated for Best Actor in a leading role. I think it's like one of 2 or 3 movies. Like it's very few. But Tom Hulce is in like nothing else. He's in Animal House. That was cool, but that was before this. He does the voice for the Hunchback of Notre Dame. That's it, though. That's it. And F. Murray Abraham, really, his big coming back was because of Grand Budapest Hotel.
Yep.
Because he was in Inside Llewyn Davis. I knew who he was. You knew who he was. We might be the only 2 who did. And then he does Grand Budapest Hotel the next year. And if you look on, Letterboxd, what are his most popular movies? Is Grand Budapest Hotel, Isle of Dogs, which was 2018, Scarface, and Inside Llewyn Davis. Those are his top 4, ahead of even Amadeus, because Amadeus just doesn't have the popularity of those other movies.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to like it's a 3-hour biopic. People The general population doesn't like that type of movie.
That's not what they want.
No, it's when you sit down for 3 hours, like you're not. 3 hours terrifies people. You tell someone you're about to watch a 3-hour movie, it has a massively different impact than saying you're about to sit down and watch a 2.5-hour movie.
It's actually kind of funny how that works because 2.5-hour movies got the same feel. It's the same thing.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It's the same.
It either feels engaging the entire time through, or it has that lull in the middle.
Yeah.
You can get that with a 90-minute movie. Like the length of the movie doesn't have to do with the pacing of the film.
Exactly.
But there's this stigma attached to a longer movie.
And especially ones that are biopics, because there's this assumption that a biopic is going to be boring and long. You know what I mean? Like it's going to be bland. Because like a movie like Gandhi, which came out won Best Picture, I believe, 2 years before this. That's not that special of a movie. Like it's really not. It's not all that interesting. I don't find it to be that great. Ben Kingsley's awesome in it, but that's really it. And so, like, that's what was happening during this time. I mean, if you look at 1980s, and I'm going to do this real quick, 1980s Best Picture winners, it's actually funny because the one that's the best biopic doesn't win Best Picture, which is Raging Bull.
Mm-hmm.
That's Raging Bull. But if you look at the other movies that won Best Picture during the 80s, you had Platoon, not a biopic, but based on a true story, all that fun stuff, or based on at least the Vietnam War. Amadeus, that's a biopic. You have Gandhi, biopic. Chariots of Fire, based on real people. The Last Emperor, biopic. And then you have Out of Africa, biopic. Like all of them are biopics.
Mm-hmm.
So it was something that people had grown stale with. And if you watch a lot of those other ones, you're not going to really be all that excited to sit down and watch them. Like I said, Out of Africa right now is the worst Best Picture winner I've ever seen. And haven't seen 7 of them.
Yeah.
So I think that also worked against Amadeus just at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, hopefully people get over that. I mean, we're almost 40 years removed from when this movie was made at this point. And it still holds up. It's one of those ones where if you have any inkling of knowledge about music or like, Mozart, and almost all of you know Mozart in some capacity, it's worth watching this movie.
Mm-hmm. It is. It really is. It's so good. Definitely something that I need to watch like more than once every 15 years.
Mm-hmm. No, it's one that I pull out every couple of years. The length of it does make it so that I'm not like watching it every year, but it's one I pull out every couple of years, and it's always a delight when I do. Honestly, on this rewatch, it's probably moving up my top 100.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't put this into my top 100, but it's definitely a movie that moves up my Best Picture winner rankings and things like that, even though I tried to do it the other day and it wouldn't let me edit it from my phone. So let me see if I can do it now. And then everybody can watch me officially do it right here on this podcast. But yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. Like it's one that it grows. It grows, and every time you watch it, you're like, I have to respect this movie a little bit more than I did the last time. Which, granted, a lot of this is just what's my taste in movies, but I'll put it right behind From Here to Eternity. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
I only have it as the 31st Best Picture winner, but that's because a lot of these Best Picture winners would end up very close to my top 100, all the ones that are ahead of it. And I've seen so many freaking movies at this point. When you're putting together a top 100 and you're like, yeah, I've seen a couple movies. It's different than like where we're at right now, where we've probably seen, 10,000 movies or some stupid shit. So Amadeus is good. But F. Murray Abraham's performance, that's up there. That's up there.
It's easily one of the best performances ever.
Yeah, it's next level. It really, really is next level. So I agree with that one. Okay. Anything else about Amadeus?
Nope.
Hope you all enjoyed Amadeus and City of God. 2 actual true stories that are kind of true and kind of not, but told in very different ways. That's for sure. Next week, we are moving on to Children of Men from 2006 and Memento from 2000. So finally, another episode where both movies are from the 2000s. I think it's the first one in a long time, probably since because I don't count the 2000 teens as the 2000s anymore. So it's been a while since we've had this. So this one should be good. If you're not a patron yet, become a patron, $5 and up. And if you're a Survivor watcher, you'll get a lot more content. But John and I have already talked about The Power of the Dog, Licorice Pizza, and what did we talk about last week?
Nightmare Alley.
Nightmare Alley. So we've talked about all those. We're going to talk about Belfast after this. We're recording 3 more of these on March 10th, and we are going to just pound through these now. So they're going to be coming out pretty quick, all before Oscar night on the 27th. And we're going to be doing our best picture, or our Oscars prediction, not best picture, Oscars prediction in general on March 23rd. So make sure to tune in for that. Last year, I wiped the floor with poor John over there. So he's got to
I'm watching all the movies this time. I'm going to have the advantage this time.
I had watched so many of the movies last time, and this time I've watched pretty much nothing. But John, as they say, I have the higher ground. You know, it's all it takes. I have the higher ground. You can't possibly defeat me now. But yeah, we're going to record Belfast after this. So make sure to become a patron at least for this month, and you'll get all of our takes, half hour, 25 to half hour on each of the best picture winners. We're going to go talk about Belfast now. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week with Children of Men and Memento.